puedo ver.
Very well. So, good afternoon, good morning.
My name is Ricardo Carioni. I am the Deputy Head of the Embassy here in London and First Secretary, and I have the greatest pleasure to give you the most warmest welcome to our speakers and everyone joining us on this live stream on our YouTube channel for this virtual roundtable, Climate Justice, Revolution, Democracy, and Imperialism. On behalf of the Government of Reconciliation and National Unity of Nicaragua, of President Daniel Ortega and Vice President Rosario Murillo, and all of us at the Embassy of Nicaragua to the UK, Ireland, and Iceland, based here in London, our sincere gratitude for your company, solidarity, and support. This is a very special occasion as we commemorate the triumph of the Sandinista Revolution, which on the 19th of July of 1979, put an end to 4 decades of one of the bloodiest dictatorships in the world, providing freedom and democracy to the people of Nicaragua, and igniting a beacon of light and hope that imperialism, injustice, and intervention can be defeated, and that a fair society with a government of and for the people, not just the rich, is possible. Today, we are also launching in the UK the latest work of Minister of Presidency for National Policies of the Republic of Nicaragua, Dr. Paul Oquist Kelly. EQUILIBRA, the philosophy and political economy of existence and extinction, which draws on over half a century of research and experience of a brilliant professional career. As such, we are very privileged and honored to have this fantastic set of speakers joining us today. We have the Ambassador of Nicaragua, Her Excellency Guisell Morales. We have Minister Dr. Oquist. We have Dr. Sofia Clark, Professor of International Politics and Relations at the National Autonomous University of Nicaragua, and former Deputy of Chief of Staff of the President of the 63rd United Nations General Assembly, Miguel Descoto Brockman, and former representative of UN missions to South Africa, Rwanda, and Haiti. We have Mr. George Galloway, leader of the Workers' Party of Britain, author, broadcaster, and filmmaker. And joining us via phone, we'll have Mr. Ken Livingstone, former Mayor of London and GLC leader, author of Being Red, A Politics for the Future. Mr. Livingstone sends his apologies as he was unable to join via video, but he will be here with us in audio and in presence. Our fantastic panel will discuss the legacy and the vitality of the Sandinista Revolution, the struggle against imperialism, interventionism, unconventional warfare, sanctions and aggressions from imperialistic powers, as well as the grave threats to humanity's existence, resulting from the pursuit of endless, unsustainable, limitless profit and greed on a finite planet, causing climate change, extinctions, desertification, hunger, diseases, and the ever-increasing danger of deadly global pandemics brought to the fore by the current COVID-19 crisis, in addition to the constant threat of nuclear war and many others, showcasing a lack of serious preparation and how little is invested politically and economically in avoiding them, as outlined and addressed in Dr. Oquist's book, EQUILIBRA. Now, I have the honor and the pleasure of introducing Madam Ambassador Guisell Morales. Madam Ambassador, the floor is yours, please. If you can please unmute, Ambassador, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to all. Thank you to all the speakers today. On behalf of the people of Nicaragua, the Sandinista Government of Reconciliation of National Unity, President Ortega, Vice President Rosario Murillo, I am delighted to be here and welcome you and express my sincere gratitude for generously accepting be part of this virtual roundtable, Climate Justice, Revolution, Democracy, and Imperialism. But also that Ricardo mentioned, is the launching of the book of my minister and good friend, Paul Oquist. And also we are celebrating today the 41st anniversary of the revolution. A revolution that ended one of the most ignominious dictatorship that the world has seen. And it inspired many people, and here in the UK and in Ireland and all over the world. We are honored to have such a range of speakers as that Ricardo just introduced to us. I will, later when I finish, I will speak also about them. But I want to refer more than anything to the 19th of July victory. That this momentous victory started the first phase of the ongoing revolution, which leaves some breathing over people. A revolution that took over a country devastated by a century of imperialist domination and confronted by a campaign of terrorism organized and funded by the US, which killed tens of thousands of Nicaraguans, as well as an economic blockade and a global defamation campaign. However, from 79 to 1990, the FSL government made remarkable achievements in healthcare, education, workers and political rights, infrastructure, the development of an added value economy, as well as the promotion of equal gender and the right of indigenous groups and Afro-Nicaraguans. After 17 years of loyal opposition since 2007, having won democratically and transparently the elections, the Sandinista government led by President Ortega and Vice President Rosario Murillo continued building on the framework laid down during the 80s, which even under 17 years of neoliberal government could not be completely erased. Despite the US unconventional warfare against Nicaragua, the Sandinista revolution has not been stopped, and its achievements are celebrated every 19th of July, including having poverty, reducing extreme poverty threefold, and lifting 1.2 million children from food poverty. A strong advancement in closing the gender gap on education and health, the strengthening of the social movement, the social economy, the development of infrastructure, and the international leadership in the fight against climate change. Since 2007, social, human, and economic development have formed a central part of the government program, with emphasis in policies which benefits the poorest and the most vulnerable in the society. 54% of the 2020 national budget has been ring-fenced for social expenditure. The Sandinista government has also focused on strengthening the productive capacity of families, the creative and social economy as the nucleus of the new society. But there are two other revolutions within the revolution. That's my take. Is now the world fifth, Nicaragua is now the world fifth more gender equal country, and that is a revolution within a revolution in a country like Nicaragua. The four above us are only the Nordic Circle, and we are the only country in the American continent in the top 10, compared with the position 62 that we were in 2006. The UN and Interparliamentary Union have ranked Nicaragua third in the world for gender balance and in politics, with women making up 42% of National Assembly. The Nicaraguan cabinet was also ranked last year as the third most female empowered government cabinet in the world by UN Women. The government has also announced the relaunch of women policy so we can win the war and win the fight against violence against women and families, and to protect women's lives. The Sandinista revolution is also a green revolution. That's the second revolution within the revolution, seeking to fight humanity's biggest challenge, climate change. In Nicaragua, it's just over a decade of Sandinista government, the national energy matrix has been transformed from less than 25% to over 80% generated by renewable sources, while providing electricity from less than 50% to over 90% of the population, thus on the path of achieving energy sovereignty. Internationally, Nicaragua has continued advocating for climate change, demanding greater commitment for developed countries with differentiated responsibilities. Despite these achievements, or perhaps because of them, of the good example of Nicaragua blessed and always free, along with other countries in Latin America, Cuba, Venezuela, and other nations around the world, we are the target of unilateral, coercive, and illegal aggressions in form of sanctions imposed by external powers, designated to harm the population to the point of endangering their lives, and which in the context of pandemic is a crime against humanity. This year, due to pandemic, we will not go to the plaza of the revolution, but with happiness in our heart, we are celebrating in every corner of the country, in every house, in every park that has free Wi-Fi signal. All of them have it. Using all the technology available, the revolution will go viral. And here we are also virtually connected with you to celebrate the achievements, the vitality, and the international solidarity with the Sandinista Revolution and our common struggles against imperialism, as well as the great threats to humanity existing resulting from the endless pursuit of profit on a finite planet, causing climate change, extinction, desertification, hunger, disease, and the ever-increasing danger of deadly global pandemic brought to the fore to the current COVID-19 crisis, in addition to the constant threat of nuclear war. As Ricardo mentioned, our first speaker will be Dr. Oquist Kelly, Minister of National Policy of the President of Nicaragua. And he's a leading expert and key actor in environmental affairs and climate action. He was co-chair of the Green Climate Fund and represented the Latin American Caribbean group of countries at the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Dr. Oquist, I will say, in a word, is a revolutionary that has dedicated his life to the Sandinista cause. In his latest work, EQUILIBRA, Dr. Oquist draw over half a century of research and experience of brilliant professional career to outline the grave threats of humanity. Next, you will hear from Dr. Sofia Clark, a distinguished academic of political science and international relations. The book of Dr. Oquist is dedicated to Father Miguel, that was Dr. Clark's uncle. And she worked also with him when he was the president of the National Assembly, the 62nd one, and she worked with him very closely. She knew him very well. She knows also Dr. Oquist, and she knows very well how all the legacy about democratizing and reinvented the proposed reinvention of United Nations, including the confront and overcome what he called the major crisis. He identified 16 major crises, and Dr. Oquist also talked about in his book. Then we will have Ken Livingstone, and I don't have, for those who lives in the UK and in Europe, there is no words to describe this very true comrade that through his life has stood unfailingly for social and economic equality, justice, democracy, and dialogue, again, always standing and defending Latin America popular movements and government. Ken is also a passionate advocate for climate justice and greener and more inclusive and egalitarian society. And we are very honored that we're gonna hear him. Here's his word. We're gonna hear his word. We're not gonna see him, but we're gonna hear his word. It's our privilege also to count with comrade and true friend of the Sandinista Revolution, George Galloway, leader of the Worker Party, and he is widely regarded as one of the finest orators in British politics, George has visited Nicaragua many times. He's known for his passionate defense of the right of sovereignty, self-determination, and freedom for the people of the world. We are delighted we will be able to hear from George talk about the meaning of the Sandinista Revolution to the world and its importance within the current geopolitical context. I can think of no better way to celebrate our Julio Victorioso, our victorious Julys, than with all of you. Great comrades, great in your passions and your loyalty and tireless dedication to a better world. You will focus, I expect, on some of the Sandinista movement and the Sandinista revolution, but also on climate justice, democracy, and the resistance to imperialism. All that is left for me to say is that the Sandinista revolution is undeterred because it has been forged by the people and for the people. We will continue moving forward with dignity. We will not stop, inspired by our national spirit and sovereignty. Hasta la victoria siempre, and please enjoy this event and share widely with your friends, family, and colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Very, very moving words and energetic words. So now I have the honor and the pleasure of introducing Minister Dr. Oquist. Minister, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. It's morning for me, afternoon, I think, for you. The book that I wish to present to you today, EQUILIBRA, the Philosophy and Political Economy of Existence and Extinction, is dedicated to the memory and example of Father Miguel de Escoto Brockman, the Foreign Minister of Peace and Dignity of Nicaragua. These wars of aggression, Father de Escoto analyzed, and occupation are led by the United States, the European countries, and others of the so-called First World against the rest of the inhabitants of the earth, who are not given the status, who are given the status of inferior beings without the right to peace and a dignified life. He also stated that states rich in ethical principles and or natural resources which do not share the empire's pretensions, such as Iraq, Iran, Libya, Venezuela, Cuba, Bolivia, Syria, Nicaragua, and many others, are always in Washington's genocidal sites. Father Miguel, following Eisenhower, identified the power center of the empire. And here I quote, "The only thing the United States represents is the interest of its own military-industrial complex," as President Dwight Eisenhower said, who must have known something about it. End of quote. EQUILIBRA describes an updated depiction of this center of power as the military, police, intelligence, industrial, and financial complex, AKA the deep state, which is more powerful than ever. Some people ask why the United States now is embarking on a second Cold War. Well, actually, I think there's two reasons for that. One, the United States is a country with many contradictions and conflicts, as has been shown in recent weeks. And it's difficult to have a united country without a common external enemy. And the Second World War was fascism, then communism, then terrorism, and none of those work now. So China is always being presented as the next enemy, and as always, it has to be demonized. There's also a second reason, and that is that the military budget plus the defense budget, of the intelligence budget rather, of the 17 intelligence agencies, 17 intelligence agencies totals $962 billion, almost $1 trillion. How can such military spending and intelligence spending be identified to the benefit of the military, police, intelligence, industrial, and financial complex if there's no enemy? If there's no enemy, how do you justify spending $952 billion. So this is unfortunately the world we live in that has to face these types of issues. EQUILIBRA presents a metaphysics and an ontology of existence to raise our level of knowledge and appreciation for the evolution of the universe, planet Earth, and life on the planet, of which we are an integral and unique part, each one of us. It also contains an ontology of extinction, which deals with the cosmic, geological, epidemiological, of which we're very conscious now with the novel coronavirus and COVID-19, and also anthropogenic threats of extinction. Actually, our greatest threats to extinction today involve our inability to deal with the consequences of our own science and technology, to wit, climate change, nuclear weapons, and artificial intelligence. With regard to climate change, the Kyoto Protocol that entered in force in 2005 was an excellent climate agreement, legally binding and with clearly specified goals. However, there was a problem in that the United States was a signatory of the Kyoto Protocol, but the Congress, the US Senate rather, never ratified it. The Europeans and Japanese, flustered by this, put together the Bali Conference so that two working groups could be formed so that the United States could be included in negotiations despite not being a party to the Kyoto Protocol. In Copenhagen in 2009, in COP15, President Obama desperately needed an agreement for US political reasons. The Chinese agreed to it. The Chinese, of course, are very big on saving face, but having lived in Asia for 13 years, I came to learn a couple of things, and one, that you also give face to a party in distress, and that's what happened in COP15. But fortunately, the ALBA countries, with Nicaragua as the spokescountry person, was adamantly opposed to an imposition of a big power agreement that ignored the rest of the world. Beginning with the Durban COP17 in 2011, the future contents of the Paris Agreement began to be defined. The European Union and the Latin American right gave concession after concession to the United States to try to get the United States back in. And this included that there would be no legally binding agreement. What they came up with, the lawyers of the Treasury, of the US Treasury, was an agreement under the convention with the force of law. We asked the Treasury lawyers what that meant, and they did not know what that meant. But we all know what it didn't mean. And it didn't mean legally binding, because that's what it was designed to replace that with ambiguities. They also tried to get rid of historical responsibilities and replace it with universal responsibilities, trying to avoid their liability for the damage they have caused, which gives rise to the call for indemnization. So all of these concessions were made to the United States, which then agreed to the Paris Agreement. But you can imagine the consternation of the Europeans and maybe some of the Latin American right when the US government, when the Trump administration announces that it is withdrawing from the agreement. So actually, if we look at the obstacles that are producing climate change problems in this world, there's two: fossil fuels and the United States, which wasn't a party to Kyoto, which gave rise to concession after concession in Paris, and which now has pulled out of Paris. At the Conference of the Parties of Climate Change, COP21 in Paris, the developed countries proposed 2 degrees centigrade, and the developing countries 1 degree centigrade as a target. There was a problem with the 1 degree position, and that was because the actual temperature was fast approaching 1 degree. So Nicaragua and Bolivia took the initiative of proposing 1.5 degrees, and the Paris Agreement finally made a compromise there, and it proposes to stop the rise in the temperature in this century by less than 2 degrees and preferably at 1.5 degrees. Subsequently, Nicaragua and Bolivia also argued that the 2-degree goal had an IPCC, that's the scientific panel, study describing what was required to reach that result. And if the 1.5 degrees centigrade did not have a similar study, it would not be considered a real real objective. It would be considered window dressing. So it was lobbied successfully, and the COP21 approved that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the panel of experts, was tasked to report on this by 2018, which they did. And their study came to concrete results. To achieve 1.5 degrees, to stop climate change in 1.5 degrees in this century, you have to have a cut in emissions by 45% by 2030 and reach zero net emissions by 2015. This is so widely accepted now that even Secretary General Antonio Guterres of the United Nations accepts this as the objective the world must follow. To reach solutions requires overcoming a repressive hegemonic power structure. And this requires fundamental economic, social, and political transformation. We not only have to stop climate change, we also need to get rid of 4,000 operational warheads that are cocked and ready to destroy humanity. We need to do this in such a way, in a phased, equal reduction of nuclear arms by all nuclear powers, declared or not. If we keep these arms laying around, sooner or later, they will be used. There's also the threat of not only nuclear war, but also nuclear accidents, miscalculations. And I would like to share with you from EQUILIBRA a few examples of this. Not only was Khrushchev and Kennedy who held the world in balance in the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, the field commanders, the operational people, also could have launched the Third World War. It states here in EQUILIBRA, the USS Beale, a destroyer, detected a submarine off Cuba and dropped training depth charges. The Soviet B-59 submarine captain didn't know, of course, that these were training depth charges. All he knew that his boat was rocking like crazy, and he ordered a nuclear torpedo, not aimed at such small fry as a destructor, but at the aircraft carrier USS Randolph that the destroyer was escorting. The order to fire required the approval of 3 senior officers according to the Soviet protocol. The second in command, Vasily Arkhipov, disagreed, and the captain surfaced and requested orders from his headquarters. If Arkhipov would have agreed to that, a U.S. aircraft carrier at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis would have been sunk off the coast of Cuba with a nuclear torpedo. That could have sent the world into World War III very easily, given the tensions at that time. We also have the cases of the September 1983, the month that Korean Airlines Flight 007 was shot down. Soviet radar showed 5 incoming ICBMs. The backup system also showed the 5 incoming Soviet ICBMs. Colonel Stanislav Petrov reasoned that a U.S. attack on the Soviet Union would not be 5 incoming missiles, it would be hundreds of missiles. So he did not react to that. The cause was reflections on the top of clouds. Those reflections, fortunately, only gave 5 blips, because that could have led also to a Second World War if there was a Soviet response to these reflections on the tops of clouds. And then there's the human factor, a third example of the dangerous world we live in, of the Russian roulette we're playing by keeping nuclear arms laying around. On 15 April 1969, North Korea shot down a US EC-131 electronic reconnaissance plane of the US Navy 90 kilometers off the North Korean coast, killing all 33 crew members. The world waited with bated breath what the reaction of the United States was to be. This was recently after the inauguration of Richard Nixon as president in January. And President Nixon, recently inaugurated, had to cope with this complex, stressful situation, and he did so by getting drunk. And in that state, he ordered a tactical nuclear attack on North Korea. National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger complied with the president's order, but also advised the Joint Chiefs of Staff that the president was blasted out of his mind, and requested that they ignore this order until the confirmation the next morning of how the president looked at this with this incoming hangover. So that shows how weak our systems of defense are against these mistakes that can be made. With regard to artificial intelligence, which is the third major anthropogenic threat to humankind, the scientists, including such luminaries as Stephen Hawking, may rest in peace, have taken very seriously the threat that robots, self-replicating, self-learning robots, could turn against humanity. A theme thoroughly worked on by Hollywood. As in the argument goes in those films, the robots could reach the conclusion that the humans are a virus destroying the world and should be eliminated. Perhaps the scientists take this so seriously because they can't think up an answer to the robot's argument that could help them convince the robots to the contrary. Actually, we not only have to overcome a repressive hegemonic power structure requiring fundamental economic, social, and political transformation, we also have to change our worldview. And EQUILIBRA identified 9 alienations that are leading us to extinction. The first alienation is to think that only the eternal is valuable and escape transient reality by creating eternity in thought, evaluating now. This we call eternalism. The second alienation is to believe that humans are not dependent on nature, but rather outside of nature, or even somehow above nature. This is supernaturalism. A third alienation is to posit that humans, as the masters of all nature, are the masters of all nature, which exists to serve us. And the degradation of the planet as a result is an inevitable constant progress. This is called developmentalism. You know, it was once thought that the planet Earth was the center of the universe. That has been quite thoroughly debunked now. However, many people still believe that human beings are the center of the universe. The fourth alienation is to place individual, group, or national consciousness or interest before our and other species' survival, ultra-individualism. A fifth alienation is to prioritize short-term marginal gains above long-term catastrophic losses, even knowing the consequences. This we call immediatism. And very serious is the fact that the hegemonic economic and political structures are largely based on immediatism, short-term gain despite long-term consequences for humanity, even knowing the consequences. The sixth alienation is to think that endless, limitless, mindless growth of production, consumption, and capital accumulation can occur on a planet with limited, degraded resources. This alienation is called capitalism, and which is an important part of that repressive structure of domination. The seventh alienation part of capitalism is to prioritize financial systems, commodity, equity, derivative markets above life support systems. Financial systems above life support systems. Seems incredible, but we see it every day. An eighth alienation is to put all faith in science and technology to replace or compensate for damages we cause to ecosystems and to environmental disequilibra. This is called scientificism. It's a messianic response that science will save us. Doesn't matter how much damage we do to the world, science and technology will always come to the rescue. There's a derivation of this, and that is a variant that it's that some people think that it's easier to go to Mars or a moon of Jupiter to live, to make the human species prevail, that's easier than to fix things on Earth, which is a very sad commentary on our situation and on their observation of solutions. The ninth alienation is fatalism, with two variants. One is providentialism and the other is nihilism. One resigned and passive and the other negative, obstructive, and prone to violence. You know, a prominent scientist was interviewed on the radio, and at the end of the interview, the gentleman who was undertaking the interview asked him, "What do you think are the chances that in our lifetime aliens will visit us looking for intelligent life on planet Earth?" He replied, "My greatest fear is that they've already arrived, searched, and left." So let's hope we could revert that poor commentary on the intelligence of the human species and address these alienations for our own good, for the survival of the species and other species. We need fundamental economic, social, and political change. In previous centuries, that has been brought about by people of different sectors in different countries using different methods, but all united by clear objectives, undertaking social movements. The objections were abolish slavery, free the colonies, suffrage for women, labor and union rights. We need a movement for survival in the face of these threats to our distinctions. Sometimes these movements fight for centuries, decades, or long years, and suddenly the goal is achieved in a very short period of time. For example, the anti-slavery movement was undertaken in the United States, the Underground Railway and other manifestations, the abolitionists in the UK, in Europe, throughout the world, it was undertaken. And for long years, there was no progress. And then in July 1831, the UK Parliament abolished slavery in the empire. In 1865, the Emancipation Proclamation abolished slavery in the United States. By the end of the century, slavery was largely abolished. How did that change take place? I think that many of these sudden transformations, when movements turn into universally accepted policy, are due to generational changes. A new generation enters the scene that is thoroughly and almost universally convinced that slavery is a profound evil and immorality that must be abolished immediately. I hope that that's the case in this 21st century, and that a new, conscious, highly mobilized youth can make the difference where previous generations have failed in putting together a movement for survival that can truly affect policy, programs, allocation of resources at the national level and at the international level. I think there are signs that that is the case. In COP25, which failed to reach a conclusion, which failed to reach objectives, I was interested in the responses of Greta. Greta had first gone to the national leaders, and that was a big deal for them and for Greta to have all these photo ops, and they discussed things. And she was disappointed that nothing came out of that. Then in the international organization, United Nations, she put great faith in that. And then she was disappointed in saying that that wasn't happening either. And so when she was leaving Madrid in COP25 last year, she said that, well, only the people can solve this. And she's right. Only the people can solve this. But it's the people organized in a movement with a clear objective that works tirelessly, with the historical patience to achieve the objective. What most impressed me in Madrid was coming back from a very late night session of the international negotiations that came to naught. And the people who had been in Greta's huge demonstration in Madrid were going home. And it wasn't surprising for me to see the 17-year-olds and the 18-year-olds with their placards, with their picket signs going home. What really impressed me, there were 10-year-olds and 11-year-olds. That to me is a sign that there could be a genuine, very deep generational change afoot. And many, these 16 and 17-year-olds will soon be 18-year-olds, and they will be voters. And in countries that have a very tight correlation of forces, how they come down could give them great power in national politics in many countries that could start to affect change. At least that is the hope. And this stage of the 21st century, the United Nations, which we've all had great hopes for, Father Descoto had also, he wrote a book on how to restructure the United Nations. But he realized in the end that it wasn't possible to restructure the United Nations because of Articles 108 and 109, which put padlocks on change in the United Nations. If the General Assembly votes for changes in the basic structure, all 5 permanent Security Council members have to approve it. So there's a veto on transformation in the United Nations. And even if you hold a new assembly to reconstitute the United Nations, and the countries of the world vote on that and decide to do it, also it states that all 5 permanent members have to approve that. So there's a veto, again, on that type of transformation. And that's when Father said that it was necessary to abolish the United Nations and start again. But while that's happening, we need to promote the survival movement and hope that the youth element can be very decisive in coming years. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister. Very, very insightful words. And we look forward to discussing a little bit further down in the virtual table some of these points. Now, on the line, we have former Mayor of London, Ken Livingstone. Ken was unable to join us on the Zoom call that's being live streamed on YouTube, but he's made a great effort and he's joining us now on the phone. So it is my honor and pleasure here on my phone next to the computer, and hopefully the audio will be on our side. So Ken, can you hear me?
Yeah, that's absolutely perfect. I mean, I have to say, though, I'm really looking forward to the end of this lockdown so we can get back to having meetings where we're all sitting in the same hall together. This disconnection doesn't actually help. But there we are. I just want to talk very briefly about what I think we need to say to people so they understand the truth. I remember that in Nicaragua, the revolution there came just 2 years before I became the leader of the Greater London Council. And immediately here in Britain, the right-wing press was saying my administration was a Livingstoneista. And I felt quite proud of that, frankly, because I think what happened in Nicaragua was an inspiration. All over the world, we have seen ghastly right-wing dictatorships overthrown and a shift of real power to ordinary people with an improvement in their quality of life. And Nicaragua was a real indication of that. And I mean, then I watched the same thing happen in Venezuela. And equally, the right-wing press all the way around the world just lie all the time. When President Chavez came to London, I was denounced. Why was I meeting a dictator? And yet Chavez had won every election he stood for. He was a complete Democrat. And yet the people reading the press, they would have been led to believe this was a dictator. So I think one of the most important things for the left is to get the truth out to the general public so they don't end up being conned by all the lies and smears. And I say that as someone, because I'm 75 now, I was born just at the end of the Second World War. I grew up in a world where we were all lied to about the threat from the Soviet Union. I remember the first American presidential election I remember was Kennedy's election in 1960. And he'd run in that election. One of his key promises was he would close the missile gap with Russia. And yet, having been elected president, when he gets his first briefing from the Pentagon, they start by telling him, well, Russia has 5 nuclear missiles that can reach America. We would have 350 that can reach the Soviet Union. So here was a man he'd been a senator for 8 years, on the verge of being president, and he knew no more of the truth than all the rest of us around the world. We'd always been lied to all the time. And the way in which the overthrowing of every right-wing dictatorship is depicted as some sort of commie revolution and all this nonsense has been to prevent people seeing that what you're seeing there is a shift of the wealth from the small number of oligarchs, the international corporations, and that wealth of a nation being used for the population. And in particular, I think there have been more American and British interventions around the world in oil-producing countries than anything else, because it's all been about the West keeping control of the oil. The situation I remember in Iran, when you had a democratically elected government overthrown and the restoration of the dictatorship of the Shah, we were all being told, oh no, this was preventing communists taking over the oil and so on. And yet the whole thing was a complete and utter lie. And I think, particularly now over the internet, so many of my younger lefty colleagues are able to get this truth out and reach people with all of that. And I think that's what we've got to carry on doing. The simple fact is our world has been one dominated all my life by the United States of America. And in all of its military interventions, never has one of those been about restoring or creating a democracy. They have all been about protecting America's commercial interests in not just oil, but many other major productions and so on. If you actually look back in 1960, when Lumumba was elected as the first leader of the Democratic Republic of Congo after the Belgians had been driven out, within a year he'd been assassinated, an assassination authorized by the United States of America, because Congo had huge uranium deposits, and America feared that Congo might and Lumumba might be prepared to sell those to the Soviet Union. So that's what every one of these interventions has been about in my life. And we've just got to keep getting across to people the truth. It's about the great international corporations maintaining their grip, power over the face of our planet. And ordinary people just being left basically, even though here in Britain we get to vote every 4 or 5 years, but increasingly all the wealth is going to the top 1%. Even when you get a Labour government elected, as it was under Tony Blair. He wasn't prepared to stand up to the great corporate interests, shift the balance of wealth to ordinary people. He just allowed the exploitation of our wealth to go on in that way. And so, we need to continue to struggle and to fight, but most important of all, to provide support. When you get a progressive government elected or coming to power, as we saw in Nicaragua and Venezuela, or frankly, even as we saw in Cuba over 60 years ago. Around the world, we need to be organising for support for those regimes and fighting to prevent America's corporate interests from overthrowing them. And that is what we've got to continue to do in all our campaigning the rest of our lives. And so I look forward to having a meeting where we're all physically together in the same room, where we can talk about what we can do to achieve this in the years to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ken. And indeed, we look forward to being able to be with you in person, as we all have had that honor and pleasure of doing so in the past.
That'll be wonderful, because we can go for a drink afterwards.
Absolutely, that's always a great pleasure. And thank you very much. These are really important points that you've made. In regards to getting the truth out, in regards to not letting our people, ourselves, and everyone being conned by governments and organizations that ultimately just seek the exploitation of the people, and really just creating a level of inequality in countries around the world, even in countries like the UK now going back to Victorian times in terms of inequality levels. But thank you very much, Ken. With that, now I have the great honor to introduce Dr. Sofia Clark. Dr. Clark, please, the floor is all yours. Thank you very much. If you want to try one more time, there you go, all muted. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Like Paul said, it's morning over here, but it's our world, and I'm glad to be with you. I want to particularly thank the Embassy of Nicaragua, our friends in London, and I don't know very well the UK, but I have a very special respect, because different members of my family have actually served the Sandinista Revolution in the UK and in Ireland. And I have always felt that the solidarity movement there was sort of at the vanguard. It was intelligent, provocative, and effective. And I hope you will continue to be so. And I am a bit humbled and very pleased to be together with Dr. Ken Livingstone and with George Galloway. I thank you. And lastly, I would like to give a particular recognition to Paul for his book, which he actually dedicated to Father Miguel. And there are several reasons that I like his book, but there's two that I would like to just bring up today. One is because I think it enables us to think farther, to think deeper about what the real problems are that we're facing. We have a tendency to get consumed with current events and to rail against the latest injustice. And Paul reminds us of the importance of what are the key issues that we need to focus on, so that they do not substitute the people's agenda, and that we have our own agenda. And secondly, because there's something very innovative about Paul's very hands-on nature to his book, which is the idea that people can actually read it and they can make their own addendums, they can make their own contributions. It's the sense that we get to be what Father Miguel coined a term that he liked to be, co-creators or co-authors of this book, which is an ongoing project. And it's something that I hope the UNAM Managua will get involved in, because I feel very strongly by becoming co-creators, then we participate in constructing knowledge. And constructing knowledge is what enables us then to take ownership and to take action. And that is to your credit, Paul. And I'm sure that Father Miguel is smiling on you today. Now I'd like to pick up, there's so many directions that one can go to, but I'm going to hone in on a particular contribution that Nicaragua has stood out for in the 1980s, and that Father Miguel had a very special role and continued to play a very key role, which was Nicaragua took at a time when there was a lot of bloodshed, great deal of skepticism, and people believed that the International Court of Justice was probably in the hands and the control of the major powers. And indeed, I would be careful today about certain types of cases, such as Nicaragua's case in the 1980s. But Father Miguel, not only because he believed in the rule of law and he pushed very hard for Nicaragua to bring its case to a court, but he also wanted to show people the importance of nonviolence and also the importance of the rule of law. It's the only thing that weak or small states have. We do not have the ability, the privilege of being able to wage wars of aggression. And if the law does not apply to everybody, then we are not living in a rule of law. We're living in the law of the selva, or the law of the jungle. And that was extremely important to him. Early on, when Father Miguel was appointed, or when he became the president of the 63rd session of the UN, the United Nations General Assembly, he had a conversation with Sir Robert John Sawyers. He was your permanent representative to the United Nations at that time, I mean, from the UK. And he asked Father Miguel, what is it that you would like to do? Do you have some goals for this period that you're going to be here at the United Nations? And Father Miguel said, well, I would like to work on the democratization of the United Nations. And he went, well, he goes, how much more democratic can you be? One country, one vote. And Father Miguel, you know, he said, this is the way they like to pretend and put a facade on things. But what is the purpose of having a vote if in the end your vote is discarded and means nothing? So you can have a United Nations today, which systematically every year votes to lift the embargo against Cuba. And two countries sometimes actually hold hostage the entire world, and the embargo continues, the illegal criminal embargo against the heroic people of Cuba. I point to all of this because Father Miguel was well aware of who the most influential member of the United Nations is, and the fact that it's actually today constitutes a dictatorship. That's what he used to call it. Why do I say a dictatorship? Well, I think, as Paul mentioned before, you know, these restrictions, as they're called in some legal terms, but the fact that the United States imposes sanctions against countries which are totally illegal, these unilateral sanctions or restrictive measures, and then you get the cloak of legitimacy is actually afforded to them by the European Union. Because when they back them up, then they make it look like it's not just the United States. And I think that this shows that there has been a real erosion in international law. And it was something that worried Father Miguel to a great extent. And he did not believe that the future of the United Nations was going to be saved by the governments, but rather by their people. So as Paul said, Father Miguel was consistently, he was the harshest critic of the United Nations. He believed it had failed. It certainly failed the people of Palestine. Today, we can look at the situation in Israel, and we see them getting ready to annex the Jordan Valley, actually take over the West Bank. And there are some very, what would I call them, lukewarm discussions in the United Nations Security Council, but certainly no effective action. And this was Father Miguel's concern, that today you could not rely upon the United States for protection or relief from an act of aggression, and even more likely, the United Nations might actually be the tool to legitimize an illegal action. And this is the state of affairs. And for this reason, he came up with his proposal for reinventing the United Nations. Because even though he was its harshest critic, he was also its most staunch supporter. the world needs a united nations. We cannot defeat COVID. We cannot defeat climate change. We cannot overcome these things in a divided world. We need to work together in a common body to address those issues which transcend our boundaries. And certainly, Father Miguel, he spoke about 16 converging crises that were facing us back when he was still alive. He died in 2016, but I know that he's still fighting for us somewhere. I think it's important to understand that he felt very much that law evolves and it has to be a living tool. And as human consciousness evolves, then so too does international law, so does our national legislation. So in that way, he felt very strongly that the United Nations had to take a role in addressing some of these problems that Paul has mentioned. And the fact that we could no longer just conceptualize human rights, but we had to think of the rights of Mother Earth and humanity. And that the goal was not just to save our species, but to actually save the ability to sustain life on our planet and in the universe. And of course, he was a deeply spiritual and profound person. He believed that there was a reverence that was owed to this earth, of which we are all a part. We are all part of the earth. And that we had to take on our role as stewards to protect that, not only in the sense of preserving us biologically, but our own nature as human beings, spiritual and otherwise, derives from having a relationship with Mother Earth. And he proposed in his proposal, and deeply aware of the fact that how that would come apart, it would not be negotiated in the confines of the United Nations headquarters or with any of our permanent representatives. He believed very strongly that we needed, and he dedicated the last years of his life to trying to create a foundation called Survive, or Sur Vive, which was meant to help lead a people's campaign to protect the rights of Mother Earth and humanity, to abolish war and work on nuclear disarmament, and also to work on democratizing the United Nations so that it would meet the people's agenda. And in this, he called for creating a commission that was not just the Commission of Human Rights, but the Commission on the Rights of Mother Earth and Humanity. And that was his recognition, just as Paul has mentioned, that you began a struggle. God bless William Lloyd Garrison and others who understood the inhumanity and the abolitionists who fought against slavery. It took a while. For a long time, Blacks were viewed, Negroes were viewed as property. But as people's consciousness evolved, then we moved into women's suffrage, we moved into the abolition of slavery, sort of. We're still working on that. But Father Miguel believed that we had to work towards defending the rights of Mother Earth, and that was a special obligation that we as humans, because we have an ability to discern information, we had a special role in protecting the rights of Mother Earth. Now, he also proposed something and participated with the indigenous peoples at the People's Summit in Cochabamba. And there what he proposed was an international tribunal on climate justice and environmental protection. Now, that may seem like a very lofty proposal, and indeed it is, but it was his contention that we had to work so that there would be responsibility for what Paul mentioned earlier, damages, indemnization, but not only that, but to stop certain practices from continuing. What is novel about the proposal of Father Miguel is that he suggests that this tribunal should be an integral part of the United Nations system, the same way we have the International Court of Justice, but he argues that it would not just determine state responsibility, but it would also determine responsibilities of corporations, as Mr. Livingstone mentioned, and also of individuals and of entities. Now, there's going to have spoilers may argue that, well, you know, that's not recognized under international law. Well, certainly in human rights law, it's very, very clear that states are the primary subject of international law, but not exclusive. And there are conventions that have already been passed, and in our national legislation, we recognize environmental law. And indeed, we have international conventions such as, let's see if I can find it here, the Basel Convention, which deals with transboundary waste. So it's the control of transboundary movements of hazardous waste and their disposal. I point that out because it becomes an important precedent. And I think it's something that we have to build on, and we have to help give legitimacy and expand what is our current understanding of human rights, and also our obligations as citizens of the world to protect the environment that we live in. These are just some small ideas. I was asked to be brief, and they deserve much more discussion. But Father Miguel, I would like to just do one final quote here. He was very eloquent, and we miss him greatly. But he mentioned at one point the fact of the war, this continual, perpetual state of war. And Paul mentioned these 17 different intelligence agencies and the fact that you need an enemy, and that war becomes an end in itself because it's so damn seductive and lucrative that people are willing to do anything to justify going to war and destroying our brothers and sisters. So Father Miguel mentioned by armed conquest, the colonial powers were able to steal, pillage, enslave, and desecrate the lands, the goods, and the peoples of the South. But I believe the greatest tragedy was not the wielding of their economic and military superiority. The greatest tragedy consisted in the all-pervasive and prevailing colonization of the intellect, the gradual assimilation of intellectual elites across the world into a capitalist system of obsessive consumption, and the pursuit of profit lies at the root of today's multiple converging crises. It has contaminated us all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Clark. Those are some really heartfelt words. As Nicaraguans, we are extremely deeply inspired and proud of had Father Descoto as a Nicaraguan representing us, and in these struggles at such a level of importance, and really, really important points that we take here. And above all, I have to say that in many ways, Dr. Father Descoto has been with us today. He's a spiritual individual as yourself, and we can feel that spirit of struggle and desire to move forward and to defeat those who want to really impose that international dictatorship through means of the so-called international law. Now, considering the time, and I appreciate all of you joining us and being with us today, I have the pleasure of introducing George Galloway. George, thank you for joining us, and the floor is all yours.
Your Excellency, Minister Paul, Your Excellency, the Ambassador, and the distinguished panel members and friends watching online, thank you for the opportunity to say a few words. They can only be a few because of the hour. I must leave very sharply at 6 p.m. London time for another broadcast. And I was going to start otherwise, but our quote that we just had from Father Miguel made me recall an episode in the mountains of Nicaragua when I was traveling with the Comandante Victor Tirado. He asked me what I thought about the concept of genius and who were the geniuses in the world. And being a man from Europe, indeed from Britain, I rattled off, I think, a list of 7, 8, maybe more geniuses. And Comandante Tirado pointed out to me that every one of these geniuses I had mentioned were Europeans. Did I imagine that there were no geniuses anywhere else in the world? And so the colonization of the mind, the colonization of the minds of the oppressed, and the colonization of the narrative in international discourse is indeed a very crucial part of what we are about. I realized when the ambassador was speaking at the beginning, it was vaguely unsettling that I have now spent 41 years standing in solidarity with the people of Nicaragua, because I was one of those inspired by the heroic victory of the Sandinista revolutionary movement in 1979. It was quite a decade for those of you, most of you, who were not around, or at least were not adult in that decade. We saw in that decade the liberation of Vietnam from a long war imposed upon them by not one but two imperialist powers. First France and then the United States of America. It was a decade in which we saw the overthrow of fascism in Spain and in Portugal, the freeing of the Spanish and Portuguese colonies in Africa and beyond. It was a decade which ended in the extraordinary victory over fascism and colonialism in Nicaragua after 40 long years. Somoza was famously, I won't swear, but was famously described by an American president in these terms: Somoza may be an SOB, but he's our SOB. And there was no doubt about either of those things. And the victory, therefore, of the Nicaraguan people in their revolution was really something to see. And the transformation of what was then, as now, a very poor country of the global south was, if anything, even more remarkable to see. From the debris, from the wreckage of 40 years of dictatorship, so quickly were the diamonds of the people of Nicaragua polished in front of our eyes, and some of us were privileged to play a very small part in helping the Sandinista movement and their government in recovering these diamonds, because they had always been there. They were just covered by the muck of 40 years of dictatorship. And when I saw, as I did with my eyes over many, many visits to Nicaragua in the 1980s, the progress that has been adumbrated earlier in the meeting, the progress in health, public health, literacy, the education of the masses, agrarian reform. I now discover, I did not know that from Her Excellency the Ambassador, that every house in Nicaragua has free Wi-Fi. I wish we had free Wi-Fi here ourselves. The role of women in the revolution, the care for children in the revolution. All of these things added together were resoundingly declared in a pamphlet, not by the Workers' Party, not by any revolutionary organization, but by Oxfam, one of the world's greatest development agencies, charities, which described Nicaragua in the 1980s as the threat of a good example. And if you think about that, analyze that title, it is telling on so many levels. First of all, that Nicaragua was a good example. But secondly, that a good example could possibly be a threat. Why would a good example be a threat? A good example ought to be followed, ought to be studied and learned from, not be regarded as a threat. The fact that it was regarded as a threat by the United States was, of course, the possibility that other countries might emulate it, might follow it, and might see the potential for themselves of this path of independent development that Nicaragua had embarked upon. And of course, it was a very great sadness when, after bitter years of terrorist warfare, and the doctor just referred to Corinto, which up to and included state terrorism by the United States, direct state terrorism by mining the ports of Nicaragua, which was condemned in a judgment by the International Court at The Hague, but not, of course, only state terrorism, state-sponsored terrorism of the most brutal and heinous kind. I don't want to be morbid, but I have seen the bodies. I have seen the corpses, mutilated corpses of the United States' Contra war. And the blood that was shed was the blood of the peasants who were learning and the teachers who were teaching them, the peasants whose health was improving and the doctors who were treating them and imbuing them with public health messages and practice, which was transforming their whole situation. And at the end of that long and bloody and no doubt very expensive counter-revolutionary struggle, the United States prevailed. And that, I thought, was the end of that. It is very rare, may even be unprecedented. I'd have to consult Dr. Paul and his great intellect on this. But it's very rare that a revolutionary movement comes back. But back it has come. And not only rescued what could be rescued from the long period of neoliberal orthodoxy and privatization and restriction on the democratic advance of the Nicaraguan people, but has in its second term, if anything, achieved even greater triumphs, which were listed earlier in the meeting. I don't need to replicate them, but the fact that Nicaragua could be at the top of an international league table on anything when it is a poor Central American country, it can be up there with Sweden and Finland and so on. These are truly remarkable achievements, which make me proud to count myself all of these decades as a partisan, as a militant for the Nicaraguan revolutionary transformation. And as Ken Livingstone said, of course, we must look forward to the day when we can, in person and in practice, do more to assist Nicaragua in its heroic, Herculean efforts. In closing, I have Dr. Paul to thank for the astonishing statistic which he gave me in the interview I conducted with him for Saturday's edition of my television program on RT called Sputnik. 39 countries and 2 billion people, that's a quarter of all humanity, are currently under sanction by the United States government. 39 countries. How do they keep track of them all? There must be a burgeoning bureaucracy in even administering that level of sanctioning. But as Minister Paul pointed out, they don't deserve the name sanction because nobody sanctioned them. They are entirely unilateral acts of financial and economic terrorism. But a quarter of all humanity is currently languishing under those so-called sanctions, and your country is one of them. And it is impossible to fathom how a country like Nicaragua, which has achieved all this, should be under sanction by the United States, except in that Oxfam title. They want to destroy Nicaragua because it is a good example. And good examples are a threat to them. They want bad examples. They want countries that they can occupy, that they can rob, and that they can manipulate and dragoon. Any country which stands up for itself, for its dignity, for its rights, will be on that list of 39 and growing countries exposed by the United States. So I salute Sandino, I salute President Ortega, I salute the militants of the FSLN. It's my joy, it's my pride to be associated with you. Hasta la victoria siempre.
Hasta la victoria siempre, George. It is us who are proud to have you as a friend, as a supporter, and as a believer. And it's interesting to hear how all these facts and that are really there showcasing the struggle and the unfairness and really of these imperialistic powers that's trying to be con. And talking about facts, just two facts that I want to point out very humbly. We not yet have Wi-Fi in all houses, but hopefully we will. We do have it in all parks, so that's even better. You come out together and join together in our parks. And the second one I would say is, and again, very humbly, the revolution, we never left. So during those 16 years, it was a different stage of a revolution. We were there, you were there. We were just in a different stage. Yes, we came back and I'm here with you. So thank you very much for your support. Thank you much for your very kind words. I say this on behalf of all the speakers and all Nicaraguans. Thank you very much. I understand we taking a lot of your time. I understand that you might not be able to stay much longer, and literally it's time for you to continue for your next show. So not sure before you go, if any final comment or farewell from anyone of the speakers. Otherwise, I'll take the honor to fare you farewell and to thank you very much. Minister, please go ahead.
I would like to just mention that some people, when I go to Europe, state that as if this is a different animal altogether from the Sandinista Popular Revolution. That is far from the truth. In the 60s and 70s, the fight was against the Somoza dictatorship. Then we had, in the 1980s, the popular victory of 1979 and the realization of the alphabetization, the literacy campaign, the agrarian reform, the area property of the people, and a whole series of different initiatives. But in the end, the victory in the 1980s was survival. Was surviving the brutal aggression by the US CIA, and which had been financed through drug money, through distributing crack cocaine in the ghettos and barrios of the United States in the 1980s, and we survived. And that's why we could come back, because we did survive. And we governed from below in the year 1900s, the 1990s rather, and the year 2000s. And that allowed us to continue to build, protecting the interests of the people, protecting the interests of the cooperatives who the neoliberals wanted to break up. And that led to the victory of 2006. Now we're in the period of harvest. So much blood and sacrifice was involved in the planting of this revolution, in the period that the seeds were planted in the 60s and the 70s and in the 80s, defending the revolution. So many heroes and martyrs. The sacrifice of the working class that at the end of the 80s was only asking for afta, rice, sugar, and cooking oil. That's all. Not asking even for money in terms of the thing. And now we have all of these advances in redistribution of wealth, restitution of rights, inclusion of excluded people, investments in projects that benefit all, the inclusion of women, the inclusion of youth, the inclusion of indigenous and Afro-descendant people, of people with special needs. This is the genuine harvest that the Nicaraguan people so richly deserve. And that's what we're defending now, are these advances of the government of reconciliation and national unity.
Thank you very much, Minister. We have people joining us through YouTube from all over the world. And we, as a moderator, I will take the moderator privilege, if you allow me, just to put from one of our viewers a question forward, to perhaps have a little bit of a small discussion with the in a few minutes that we have left from today's virtual table. This is a question touching on some of the points that I think all the speakers have made, into looking into the future, into having that inspiration from the past, but looking into the future and the new generations, which is still is a future that looks very challenging, but there are signs of positive signs. You mentioned, Greta, you mentioned the survival movement that is brewing and is starting to have its fruits, and as your own book in itself, which is a EQUILIBRA, an interactive, evolving live work, fostering that survival social movement that constructs a low carbon, climate resistant, resilient, circular, sustainable society and with far greater equality. So on that note, and a question from the UK, thinking of the future and next year in Glasgow in COP26 and what's happening now, what are your thoughts from, to be Dr. Clark, Dr. Oquist, as you would like to take any points of that, but the road to Glasgow and what's happening. Do you have any outlooks, any thoughts, what could happen, what you would like to happen? In the UK and other governments, it talks a lot of ambition to get a lot done, a lot of progress. So our viewers and our people joining us would like to know a little bit, what is your thoughts of what comes ahead to the road to Glasgow? If I may ask that, Minister.
What should happen in Glasgow is what should have happened in Madrid in COP25 last year. But it didn't happen because the Chilean presidency could not say no to the United States and the developed countries. So we would negotiate things, and then the presidency would take them under consideration and come back with a developed country position. That's not a negotiation. That's not a negotiation. So the Latin American right, the group of Lima, the Chileans, so beholden to the United States, could not in good faith be president and negotiate. I had told several people there that there was a solution to the impasse, because the European countries, the developed countries, want to keep their carbon markets going, the European carbon market. And for that, they needed the approval of the Article 6 of the Paris Convention. The developing countries want finance in general because they've been deprived of finance from the developed countries who are committed to giving this from the very beginning. And in particular, to begin to recognize loss and damages as a category in the climate negotiations. There's mitigation to reduce emissions. There's adaptation to prepare the societies to receive the blows of climate change. And then there's the losses and damages where it actually happens. And now we have Dominica, the island of Barbuda and Antigua Barbuda. And in the Commonwealth of the Bahamas, we have Abaco and Grand Bahamas that are flat, being destroyed by greater than Category 5 hurricanes, Category 6 plus hurricanes. And there's no international answer to that, even though in 2013 in Warsaw, a mechanism was created, but the United States blocked it there being any finance in that mechanism. It was just a study group, a study of loss and damages. So the developed countries should give the developing countries finance, should give them the recognition of loss and damages. Hillary Clinton in 2009 in Copenhagen mentioned $100 billion a year beginning in 2020. And, this is in 2009. So it produced sort of a lost decade as you're waiting for 2020, which is kind of ridiculous because climate change doesn't begin in 2020, as we all know. But it's not coming. It's a farce. There's no $1 billion a year beginning in 2020. They might try to come up as they did previously to justify this with accounting books and say that, oh, we spent this. But that's all discretional by different countries. It's not free, open, access, cash flow that we can all access through the financial mechanism of the convention, to wit, the Green Climate Fund, the Global Environment Fund, the Adaptation Fund as the main ones. And then the developing countries can let the developed countries have the continuation of their carbon market. So that's the trade-off that should have happened in Madrid and didn't happen and could happen in Glasgow. The United States was always throwing wrenches in the machinery, and that was the case in Madrid, even though they have declared they're going to leave the Paris Agreement, but they'll still be within the Convention on Climate Change, which means they will go to the COPs. But when it's sitting as the Paris Agreement, they will no longer have a seat. So maybe some progress could be made there. Unfortunately, the United States has consistently been the problem in climate change. We have them not ratifying the Protocol of Kyoto. Then Bali was put together to include them, even though they weren't in Kyoto. The Europeans and Latin America made concession after concession to the United States, so the Paris Agreement was weakened, made voluntary rather than legally binding, and the commitments voluntary also to please the United States. And then what happens? The United States retires from the Paris Accord and is not in on the deal, the largest economy in the world. However, fortunately, California, Colorado, Washington, Oregon, and the vast majority of the big cities in the United States are committed to fulfilling the quotas, the commitments of the United States. There's a movement called We're Still In, which is very interesting because it's a movement of state and local governments and corporations that want to fulfill this. But there's a formula for success in Glasgow if everyone wants to make some concessions, mutually beneficial concessions, to reach an agreement. And that's how agreements are reached in the United Nations. So I am hopeful that after the failure of Madrid, this will be able to be put together in Glasgow.
Thank you, Minister. And that's a very important message of a cautious hope, but hope is the last thing we lose. And I think with a lot of effort, something can be achieved, hopefully. Dr. Clark, not sure if you had anything you wanted to add from your perspective in regards to what's coming ahead. Could be around the COP26, but more in the international law. So coming from that similar question, any further thoughts before we can close before we can wrap up the roundtable? If you want to please unmute, sorry.
I'd just like to say, I think there's something special about being in Europe that you can contribute as a counterpart to the United States. The United States is always extremely leery about entering into engaging commitments. which is why we have the United Nations, where we have a General Assembly, which basically makes recommendations. So the only one that makes binding agreements is the United Nations Security Council, and ostensibly the International Court of Justice. Its decisions are binding, but they have no way to enforce them. But I think the experience that Europe has, one with different treaties of their own accord, but also through the European Union, even though I realize the UK is now exiting the European Union, but you don't seem to have that deep-grained fear of taking on commitments. And you see it with your court systems on human rights and on other issues, and you see it also with commercial, with environmental issues. And I think that it needs to be questioned, and particularly with the United States, that it is counterintuitive. It is not logical to engage in different types of discussions in international forums and multilateral bodies and to refuse to accept binding agreements. And that has to be taken as a basis that is unethical and not acceptable. And I think it has to come from the people's voice pressuring. It's very difficult, but I think in the end, we have to be willing to accept the fact that the United States may not participate. And I think the feeling, we've bent over backwards at the United Nations, always feeling that if the US doesn't sign on, then the thing is a failure. But if we sign on under the US conditions, we actually are making it a non-starter. It's not going to do anything anyway. We have a problem that the United States is considered a member of the United Nations, but it has never considered itself subject to international law. It does it when it's convenient. It's nicer to be on the right side of the law, but rarely is. And at the same time, the United States is not held bound either by the Charter or by basic principles of international law. We have to decide if the rest of the world will be. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doctor. And indeed, those are really, really important points. And it's always easier to be on the right side of a judgment rather than the other one when international law it can be of use, and when it's not, it's ignored. And we know the only state in history ever found guilty of terrorism against another state, which know which one it is, and we know that disregard for the law. But I before we close, wanted to give one more time if anyone, the ambassador or the minister, wanted to give us some final comments, some final words, or to come back to some of the points that Dr. Clark made, please. Minister, if you would like to please unmute and go ahead.
I wish to comment on two things that ex-mayor Livingstone mentioned. He mentioned the weakness of the politicians in these issues. In EQUILIBRA, there's a sentence that I think summarizes many of the situations that he was describing. And it states, the politicians cannot control the monopolists, bankers, and speculators, because the monopolists, bankers, and speculators control the politicians. We have to look at the real dynamic of the political systems and why these economic interests are always prevailing. Then he mentioned a meeting at the beginning of the Kennedy administration that was with the generals, with the Joint Chiefs of Staff. This meeting is described in EQUILIBRA Volume 1 as follows. Curtis Bumsaweda May, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, made the proposal to the new president in 1961 of a preemptive nuclear strike on the Soviet Union in December 1963. When Kennedy asked about why the December 1963 date, he was told that that was the moment that the USA would have a maximum advantage in warheads. Kennedy walked out of the meeting and commented to Defense Advisor McGeorge Bundy, "How can we call ourselves human beings with this kind of proposal?" Years later, Kennedy biographer Arthur Schlesinger sought to confirm the meeting with Bundy, who answered, "Oh, you mean the meeting in which the generals wanted to blow up the world?" Then we must recall that Kennedy was assassinated in November 1963, just before this December deadline, in a plot that was put together to point at the Soviet Union. Lee Harvey Oswald, having lived in the Soviet Union, the supposed visit to the Soviet embassy in Mexico City, the call to a KGB agent in Mexico City, both of which proved to be false, both of which proved to be setups, showing that this was trying to provoke a war with the Soviet Union, which plays into this 1961 meeting as well. So now we have similar situations with these measures, these coercive measures that were just applied now to all the members of the Communist Party of China as part of this erecting a second Cold War. The world now confronts simultaneously the pandemic, COVID-19, the Great Depression 2020, which will last for several years, extreme inequality. We had the 1% before the great lockdowns, before the economic impact of those lockdowns. But within the lockdowns, Jeff Bezos made $29 billion in 4 months with the principal of Amazon. And in the same time period, 49 million US workers went into unemployment. Can you imagine the increase in inequality that means? And then at the same time, we have the Cold War, the second Cold War that the US is rapidly putting together with China. A country like Nicaragua that controls its own foreign policy, that controls its own destiny, that has its own self-determination of its own models for undertaking health, for undertaking social development, for reducing poverty, for confronting these illegal coercive measures, is very well placed indeed to be able to benefit from the stability that this gives and the fact that we can have a population that can organize and mobilize to confront all of the challenges that await us in the future. So the revolution, the Sandinista Popular Revolution is very much alive. It's in the harvest phase. It's defending the interests of the Nicaraguan people at every step of the way, including the COVID-19 and the response to that, which was designed to protect the poor people of Nicaragua, which is always the first priority, defending the majority of the poor in Nicaragua of the Sandinista National Liberation Front and the government of reconciliation and national unity. Thank you to the ambassador. Thank you, Ricardo. Thanks to Sofia, to Ken, and to George. It's always a great pleasure to hear George speak. I was with George and the ambassador at a meeting in London. There was solidarity with Brazil because the coup had just occurred in Brazil. Brazil, Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua. So we were on a panel and George was on the panel. And as we were walking out of that in the hallway, a newspaper reporter, a right-wing newspaper reporter, tried to bait George and said, Galloway, when will there be an end to the torture of political prisoners in Cuba? And he answered in a nanosecond, as soon as the U.S. base in Guantanamo is closed. I like that that belligerence and that brilliant defense of the popular interests of our countries and our peoples.
Thank you very much, Doctor. And with that message of responding and standing up and not being quiet against injustice and about speaking the truth. On a personal note, many takeaways, I think, from everyone here who have joined us today. Appreciate staying with us throughout. It's been an incredible privilege, really. And we could spend here, I think, days and days. And these are the kind of topics that just really, really get us going. And there's so much depth into them. But today, I hope that we've been able to give a little bit of justice to Fala Descoto, that we've been able to do a little bit of justice to the Sandinista Revolution, and that everyone who joined us today have been able to take away something of what that vitality and that light full of life moment that the Sandinista Revolution meant back in '79. And again, on a personal note, as a child of the revolution, I can definitely say that we live it every day, we exist because of it, and we look forward to the future with a message of there are challenges, we need to work hard, and some of these takeaways of looking ahead and in an ethical way, trying to reconstruct together, to be cooperators, collaborators through multilateralism, defeating those great threats, the nuclear war, artificial intelligence, inequality, climate justice, climate injustice in that sense. And I think all of our speakers today have been really, really eloquent in expressing that. So with that, I thank everyone who joined us from all over the world today. And not final point for us is to say once again, in a celebratory mode, given still the difficult circumstances, because a triumph of a revolution will always spark that joy to really stand up to difficult situations as we have since then. So hasta la victoria siempre, viva la revolución, Julio victorioso siempre. ¿Cuál es la consigna? El pueblo no se detiene. Muchas gracias. Thank you very much. And thank you for joining us. Have a good rest of the day.